A man once stood before God and was given a choice. He could have anything he wanted: wealth, power, long life, his enemies crushed beneath him. But he didn't ask for any of those things. He only asked for wisdom. That man was Solomon, and for a time he was the wisest person who ever lived. People traveled across continents just to hear him speak. His words built a kingdom, resolved disputes, made the foolish tremble. But wisdom didn't save him. In the end, it wasn't war, famine, or betrayal that ruined Solomon. It was nobody else but himself. That's the thing about wisdom. It doesn't come from knowing the right answers. It comes from living them. And most people don't. They think wisdom is intelligence, strategy, or being ahead of everyone else. But wisdom is something deeper. It's the one thing that stands between peace and chaos, stability and regret, a life well lived and a life wasted. Most people realize this too late, after they've spoken when they should have been silent, after they've trusted the wrong people, after they've ignored the warnings, and by the time they finally understand, the damage is already done. So what is wisdom, really? And what does it take to live by it? Because if Solomon himself, the man God called wise, could fall, then the rest of us are walking on even thinner ice. This is essential wisdom for the Christian life, and what you're about to hear might just save yours. While many may think wisdom starts with experience, it doesn't. Not with age, intelligence, or even good intentions. It starts with something deeper, something that most people overlook until it's too late. It starts with fear. Not the kind that makes you cower or paralyzes you, but the kind that makes you see clearly, the kind that makes a man fall on his knees before something greater than himself. Solomon had that at first. When he was young, when he was just a boy thrust onto a throne too big for him, he understood something that most rulers never do, and that was the fact that he was not in control. He stood before God and asked for wisdom, not for his own sake, but because he knew he wasn't enough on his own. That's the true beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord, not terror, not blind obedience, but the deep, sobering awareness that you are small and God is not, that you do not run your own life, that you are not the master of your fate, that if you try to be, you will fail. And yet, most people try anyway. They trust their own instincts, their own reasoning, their own desires. They walk into decisions like they own the future or even see it, like they control the outcome. They live like there is no God, even if they say they believe in Him. But the wise, they walk differently. They live with the weight of something bigger than themselves. They understood what Solomon understood when he was young. Without God, wisdom is impossible. And yet Solomon forgot this, and that's when everything started to fall apart. Solomon's downfall didn't happen overnight. Wisdom isn't something you lose in a single moment. It fades slowly, choice by choice. And one of the first things to go, the ability to stay silent. People think wisdom is about having the right answers, but more often than not, it's about knowing when to say nothing at all. Job's friends thought they were wise. When Job lost everything, his family, his fortune, his health, they sat with him in silence for 7 days, but then they made a mistake. They started talking. They tried to explain why it happened, and tried to rationalize suffering as if they were God Himself. They said things that sounded true, but weren't. And when God finally spoke, He didn't correct Job, He corrected them. In Job 38:2, Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? That's what most people do. They speak first. They assume they understand. They give advice they shouldn't be giving, and in doing so, they prove just how little they actually know. The wise don't do this. They listen before they speak. They don't fill silence just because it's uncomfortable. They don't answer questions no one asks them. They don't give opinions before they understand the full story. They don't try to control situations with their words. James wrote in 1:19 of his book that you should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But today, everyone does the opposite. They're quick to talk, slow to listen, and even faster to get offended. They debate strangers on the internet. They argue over things they barely understand. They believe every thought in their head deserves to be heard. And yet, when you read about the wisest people in Scripture, you don't just notice what they said. You notice what they didn't say. Jesus, when the Pharisees tried to trap him, often responded with a question or silence. Mary, after the angel told her she would give birth to the Son of God, treasured these things in her heart, according to Luke 2:19. Even Solomon, when he first became king, didn't declare his greatness. He admitted his ignorance, but later in life, he stopped listening. He surrounded himself with voices that told him what he wanted to hear. He let his heart be pulled in different directions. He lost the humility that made him wise in the first place. And in the end, the man who once spoke wisdom became the fool. Because wisdom isn't just about speaking the right words. It's about knowing when to say nothing at all. Solomon had everything: wealth, power, wisdom. But even the wisest man in the world wasn't immune to one fatal mistake. He surrounded himself with the wrong people. And that's how he fell. It happens to people all the time. They don't wake up one morning and decide to ruin their lives. They drift. They compromise. They let the wrong voices get close. And before they realize it, they've lost their way. That's exactly what happened to Solomon's son, Rehoboam. When Solomon died, Rehoboam became king. He had one job: to lead wisely, but the people came to him with a request: lighten the heavy burdens Solomon had placed on them. The elders told him to listen, to rule with wisdom, to show mercy. But Rehoboam didn't like their advice, so he turned to his friends, men who had grown up with him, men who told him what he wanted to hear, men who had no wisdom, only ego, and their advice was to make their yoke heavier. 1 Kings 12:14. So he did. He ignored wisdom and followed fools, and in one decision, he lost half his kingdom. Proverbs 13:20 says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." People don't like to hear this, but your friends shape your future. The people you listen to, the people you allow to influence you, they either pull you toward God or away from Him. Judas walked with Jesus for 3 years, but in the end, it wasn't Jesus' words that shaped his actions. It was the whispers of the Pharisees, the weight of silver in his hands, the regret of a decision he couldn't take back. Samson was chosen by God, set apart from birth. He had strength no one could rival. But it wasn't an army that defeated him. It was one person, a woman he loved but shouldn't have trusted. In 1 Corinthians 15:33, Paul says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good character." He says this because people think they're strong enough to resist influence. They think they can stand in the middle of foolishness and not be affected. But no one is above this. Not Solomon, not Rehoboam, not Judas, not Samson, and certainly not you. And that's why the first sign of wisdom isn't just knowing what to do. It's knowing who to walk with. Wisdom is easy when life is easy. It's when life falls apart that you find out what you really believe. Joseph was 17 when his own brothers sold him into slavery. 17, locked in chains, dragged away from everything familiar. He had every reason to be bitter, every reason to give up, every reason to believe that God had abandoned him. But he didn't. He worked. He waited. He endured betrayal after betrayal, first by his brothers, then by Potiphar's wife, then by the cupbearer who forgot him in prison. But through every trial, Joseph did something most people don't. He remained faithful and forgiving. Years later, when he stood as second in command over all of Egypt, the very brothers who had betrayed him came begging for food. He could have had them executed. He could have thrown them into the same kind of suffering they had put him through. But he didn't. Instead, he said something that only a person who had gained wisdom through suffering could say. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20. That's what wisdom in suffering looks like. It's seeing past the pain. It's understanding that trials aren't just obstacles. They're teachers. James wrote in 1:2-3, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that their suffering has a purpose while they're still in it. But the truth is, wisdom isn't learned in comfort. It's forged in fire. Look at Peter, the man who swore he would die for Jesus, until a servant girl's question made him deny even knowing him. But after his greatest failure, after his deepest regret, Peter didn't run. He didn't give up. He let his suffering teach him. And years later, the man who once cowered in fear stood boldly before the same people who had crucified Christ, preaching with power, without fear. Paul, beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, abandoned, knew suffering more than anyone, but he called it light and momentary troubles that are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all, in 2 Corinthians 4:17. Because that's what wisdom does. It doesn't just endure trials, it transforms them. It sees God at work, even in pain. But not everyone learns. Some people suffer and only become bitter. Some go through hardship and only come out more hardened, more cynical. The difference? The wise let trials refine them. The fool lets trials destroy them. And the question is, which one will you be? Solomon built a kingdom with his wisdom. He wrote proverbs that shaped generations. He had wealth, knowledge, and influence beyond what any man could dream. But at the end of his life, do you know what he wrote in Ecclesiastes 1:2? Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. The wisest man in the world, the one who had everything, realized he had nothing because wisdom without love is empty. Paul said it best in 1 Corinthians 13:2. "If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, but do not have love, I am nothing. Nothing. Not less, not incomplete. Nothing." The Pharisees had wisdom. At least they thought they did. They knew the Scriptures inside and out. memorized every law, studied every prophecy. But when the Son of God stood before them, they missed him. Why? Because they had knowledge, but no love. They could quote Moses, but they couldn't see grace standing right in front of them. And yet Jesus, the only one who truly had the wisdom of God, didn't use his wisdom to condemn people. He used it to love them. When a woman caught in adultery was thrown at his feet, the Pharisees demanded judgment. By law, she deserved death. That was the wise thing to do. But wisdom isn't just knowing the law. It's knowing how to apply it. Jesus didn't ignore her sin. He didn't pretend it didn't matter. But instead of casting the first stone, he turned to the crowd and said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." John 8:7. One by one they walked away, and then the only man who had the right to condemn her chose love instead. In John 8:11, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." That's the greatest wisdom. Not intelligence, not insight, not strategy. Love. Because in the end, wisdom without love is nothing. Knowledge without love is nothing. Success, achievements, being right, winning arguments, it all fades, but love remains. Jesus was the wisest man who ever lived, but he wasn't remembered for his knowledge. He was remembered for his sacrifice. And if wisdom doesn't lead us to love more deeply, then it isn't wisdom at all. Wisdom isn't something you master in a day. It's a lifelong journey of listening to God, walking with the right people, enduring trials, and loving well. You don't have to figure it all out today, but you can take the first step right now.